Hey folks, 2-on Bill McGrath here with a review of the new Condor Terrachete Machete. Stay tuned. So, for many years I've been a fan of the classic Filipino barong in the blade shape. And here's a wooden trainer here. But what kept me from using it was the fact there's no guard on it, right? So if you did do a thrust, even though it's a great point, I'm worried about my hand sliding down the blade. Then several years ago, Cold Steel came out with their barong machete, and this did have a good handle. There was enough of a grip here to fit my hand, and there's a bit of a stopper here, so if you had the thrust, you could do that. The problem with the Cold Steel machetes was their sheath. They're not bad, and it helps keep the price down, but I like to be able to take a machete out of a sheath or blade out and put it back in repeatedly as needed without having to fiddle with snaps and try to fit that tiny little gap that you see in a nylon sheath. So what I did was, back with my old barong machete, there's a 12-inch blade on this. I took one of these Ontario plastic sheaths that are meant for a military belt. You see the hooks here. And they're meant for an 18-inch machete. Just cut it down to about, I don't know, ½ inch or so longer than the blade, and slip these in, and they have a nice size opening. It's easy to get them in and out. The problem with this, of course, is if you have this on your hip and you take a spill down a hill, you know, it may not stick and it might fall out, and you wind up falling on the blade. So, recently, Joe Flowers over at Condor designed what he calls a Terrachete. And the handle shape comes from the Terrachete bushcraft knife they make. And it's a nice design. It has that classic weight forward barong shape. It has a center point. You know, if you look at a classic, here's a Tramachina Latin style machete, that this is a slightly slipped back. I don't know if you see it on the table, but there's a ½ inch gap here where it dips down below the point and the butt, so it seats back that way. It has, you know, it has a point technically, but you're almost facing, you know, you're almost flat on the target if you were to use this for a thrust. So you're limited where you would use this if you wanted to thrust with one of these, right? So the advantage of Terrachete, one, it has a nice thick spine, starts off thick, you have a distal taper down towards the point, which gives you a better hand speed and better balance. They grind it with a flat Scandi grind down here by the base, and then the point of percussion where you'd be doing the hitting with this, which usually is right behind, is right where the widest part of the blade starts, so we're going to say in this area, is a very nice convex grind, what they used to call Appleseed or Moran grind, so it rounds over slightly, which gives you good strength where you need it, where you're going to chop. You're not going to chop over here. This is good for fine woodworking. Another thing I like a lot with this machete, let me put my drink down, is the handle length. If you see, I got pretty big hands, and I have, if I choke up towards the front, I have a full finger width of room before that hook on the end. You know, you can see the same thing, perhaps a little better even on the front end. So you want that gap. I want some length in there. Yeah, well, your hand fits that. You got plenty of extra room. Yeah, but when I go to press with the point, can you see how I actually utilize that full length of the handle? So here's a better look at the grip, the handle. In a hammer grip, at least start of a chop with a hammer grip, you're at pretty much right angles to your forearm. You might cast that forward slightly at the end of a strike, like a hammer type strike. And now I'm getting a little closer to the butt end of the handle, you notice. However, if I go to a straight thrust, you see how that length on the butt diminishes as I go closer to a straight thrust. And I'm actually utilizing, you can see that pommel is actually fully in contact with my hand, which is good because, you know, I don't have anything else but, you know, the handle here. I don't have like a big bell guard on it, like a saber or a cutlass, to keep my hand from moving around. So you actually use a you use a handle, every part of this handle, the full length of it, when you start moving to different grips. So there's hammer grip, beginning. Here's casting forward on a hammer grip. And here's a straight thrust grip, or a fencer's grip. And you see my thumb is still on the grip material here, you know, it's coming off a little bit. So I could probably use, you know, a straight down handle instead of that center line point. And let's take back a little bit. And you see, you know, in a straight thrust, I'm using every bit of that handle length and then some, right? So, you know, don't look at a handle and just assume all you need is the front where your fingers make contact with the handle. As you move into different grips, you're going to be using more and more of that length. And this handle is over 6 inches in length. And you could see, you know, I got pretty big hands. I'm using every part of that length to maintain contact with the handle and maintain a firm grip, depending on what type of grip I'm using. So, something to think about, guys. Don't sell yourself short. You want a long handle on a blade used for defensive purposes. So, another factor that makes a defensive blade for me is the scabbard. I really consider this part of a full package. You know, you wouldn't put an expensive handgun or quality combat handgun in a cheap holster. Same thing with, you know, with a blade you're going to use defensively. You want a scabbard that holds it securely, keeps it from cutting you. You know, you don't want thin leather. I do like leather, but you don't want the thin stuff. Or very thin plastic. This is a injection molded polypropylene from Condor. You can see it's a pretty thick stock compared to some of the Kydex sheaths out there. Joe Flowers tells me that this actually holds up better, this material, in cold. Does not get brittle, as does Kydex. You can see here there's a drainage hole in the bottom. It's pretty small, probably 1/8 inch by 1/4 inch. I might open that up when I get mine, when they start going on sale later. I don't know exactly when they're going to go on sale. I'll have to let you know once Joe speaks to Condor and gets back to me. But you'll see there's a split back here, which is useful for a broad blade like this. Probably would also help on a kukri, things of that nature. And you see how that polypropylene flexes out to increase the gap and bite a little bit, but through friction to hold that blade in place. The back, the lanyard loop is leather, which I like. It has the right amount of flexibility, and it's a thick, good quality leather. Good Chicago screws in the back holding it on to there. The two screws here hold the clip portion onto the main body of the scabbard. And in the production version, they have a leather loop that comes around that you would unsnap back here, and you'd pull this out. Look at let me get the cold steel out here. Look at the opening you have, the difference in size between the nylon sheath on the cold steel and the polypropylene sheath on the Condor. Look what a large hole you have. It's a much easier target to hit, to put the sheath back. And you know, if you're working, you know, hiking the trail and you're just occasionally cutting brush, a vine out of your way or whatnot, and then you put this thing back, and you're hiking, a long period of time in the heat, and you're tired, you want something that's pretty much idiot-proof when you put that back, right? So I like the design of this sheath a lot. It's a lot less expensive to manufacture these injected molded polypropylene sheaths than it is to do Kydex, which has to be hand fit. The Condor Bolo machete is about the same size as this, and it's, I think, about twice the price, or pretty close to twice the price, because they're using a hand fit Kydex scabbard, where this is just injected molded. A few rivets would have to be hand done, and the screws in the back set up, but it's a lot easier to do that with a piece that's molded in place and then just assemble the pieces. It's a lot easier to do that type of assembly than making a Kydex sheath. The things I might change on this when I get mine, there's a lanyard hole here that just fits a piece of freshly cut paracord. If I were to use a lanyard, I don't, but if I were, I'd probably chamfer that edges with a chamfering drill bit to smooth them out. They're not quite sharp, but they're enough of an angle I'd worry about cutting the lanyard after a period of time. There's a lanyard hole here that's shaped like the eye of a condor, I think they call it, which is kind of a half moon shape. I would probably open that up. And the idea of the two lanyard holes, it gives you two positions. And there's one style of lanyard, Joe showed us on our class the other day, where you tie from the butt lanyard hole to the choil lanyard hole and put the strap across your back of your hand. So if you did lose it and let go, it would fly out of your hand. It would not swing back and hit you, which is a bad thing to happen. I probably, if I wanted a lanyard, I don't, because I want to be able to get to this quickly. But I would probably use the NYPD style, which is to have the lanyard in here and just loop it around your thumb. So it's going from the thumb to the pommel. If you let go, it has more of a tendency to slide off easily. I also might extend this standy portion a bit farther forward and maybe put a bit of a rounding off in this area so that I'd round over the edge of my finger, fit more comfortably. If you're doing a lot of work with Scandi, you want to be able to get in there and do your carving without, getting a blister or whatnot, or chafing or abrasions on your finger from the edge here. A lot of times I'll take, if I have enough meat there, I'll make a little half circle, just a divot, so I can get right into the full part of the depression there, let's say, and that gives me a good safety factor. I don't slide up onto the cutting edge. Although if you index off of the back here, where the handle sticks up a bit, you could probably get away with it without that, but I would still round that over. I'd round over back here where my thumb sits, and then I would take my belt sander, or you could do this with a file too, and flatten that back up in here so I can use it as a planer or things like that, and also to scrape a ferro rod. Quick question for you: why do they call it striking a ferro rod when you're actually going to scrape it? I don't know. And then I might round over this section here, so if I'm using it as a draw knife, I'm not, running against a sharp corner. But all in all, I really like this design a lot. It's hard for me to find knife handles and machete handles that are big enough to fit my hand. Compare this to the the Terrachete lat machete. I was only 6'1" as a young man at my full height. I'm 62 now, you shrink a bit, guys. But you can see here, if I go to a point grip, my hand slides off the end of that. So probably have bigger hands than the guys in South America, some of them at least. And even the grip on the cold steel machete, while it's big enough to keep in my hand, and just do regular cutting If I go point forward, I lose a little bit of the pommel, loss of contact. And with the bigger machetes from cold steel, I find that that can get levered out of your hand if your hands are sweaty or it misses. The bigger machetes on cold steel, I actually like the kukri style grip. It fits my hand better. But anyway, as that is, let me go ahead and show you some cutting with this and some testing I do with all my defensive blades, just a stress test. It's not, you know, it's not as severe as some people, but it's enough to give me a baseline for what I want out of a defensive blade. So because the Terrachete sits with that leather belt loop, hold the handle above your belt, I find it more comfortable to take this in a cross draw or wear it in a cross draw. And because there's a slot in the back of the scabbard from about here, you know, to the opening, you may not want to grip it with a full grip. You'll find the back of the blade, you know, rub across your web of your palm here, which can be a bit disconcerting, even though it's not dull side. I'm comfortable with this type of sheath, having my fingers in the front because of the rivets in front, but then I wouldn't want to squeeze it either. So simply cupping it and riding it forward is very easy to do. Come in, grab the sheath, and you have your draw, right? So a lot of testing I do, at least initially, is on these old pressure-treated lumber 4x4 ties that we used to have in our garden. We bought the house 30 years ago. These things, we dug them up because we want to use, I believe they used arsenic in the old days to keep the insects out. And they were sitting in dirt for however long the previous homeowners had them. But they're still, the wood is still in good shape, so they're good for testing blades. And what's nice about having a convex edge is you can chop on these pretty extensively and you get very minimal getting stuck in the wood, and it's very temporary. And if you could see here, you know, there is no problem with that edge. I see no rolling, no glinting. The edge is in very good shape. So just something on a little more on testing, and especially on wearing this sheath. Putting back, you get to take a little time, but you can, you know, get this out pretty quickly because of the design. Okay, a bit more on the sheath for the Condor Terrachete. So let me show you the stress test I've been doing on my defensive blades for a while. And this I consider a minimal test just to see the baseline. I want it to at least pass this simple test before I would consider it as a good defensive blade. And all I'm doing is, you know, chopping into the wood. It's a suspended log. This is old, either red or white oak, I forget. But it's a tree fell in my yard a while back, and it's been drying a couple of years. This is pretty tough wood. The other one I'll do is a thrust, and what I'm looking for here is a lack of too much flex. I don't want too much flex in this blade. If you notice, you might not be able to see, I can get a little flex to this, but I think it's thick enough that it's not easy to flex. Why is that useful in a defensive blade? If I'm attacked by an animal on the trail and I have to stab the thing to defend myself, that stiffness allows it to penetrate ribs, allows it to penetrate, you know, the thicker skin of an animal, probably thicker than human skin, and I'll get a good thrust. And that's really what you want on an animal even close to your size to stop the fight, the attack quickly, is a thrust rather than a chop. You can do it, but you got to get to the side and hit the spine, which is not that easy. It's a lot easier to get a thrust on an animal that's attacking you. That's why a spear is a better tool than a sword. Let's say if you're going after dangerous game, right? Anyway, but if I had to use a machete as a defense against an animal attack, I'd want one with a stiff blade, with a good center point, and a nice spear point, let's say, shape, or barong point for better, easier penetration. Let me show you something with the Traumatina and show you why I prefer the stiffer, thicker edged machetes. So for one thing, this Traumatina, they're inexpensive. I think I got this less than 10 bucks, but you can see the amount of flex there, which is good for a grass blade or a vine blade, something you might, you want it lightweight, you want it to move, you want it to flex. If you do get stuck, I'm going to get it deliberately stuck in this in a minute, and as you're pulling out, you can see it's flexing rather than breaking. If you did have to baton with this, it'll flex around a knot, less likely to bend and take a bend, or definitely less likely to break. The hardness on these is they're not hardened as hard as a, say, a skinning knife or something like that, which is in the mid to upper 60s perhaps. These are low 60s, high 50s a lot of times. But anyway, one thing I don't want flex on the thrust, because that impedes your ability to penetrate on the thrust. And then of course you can see, let me get the Condor. So you can see the difference in tips between the Condor and the Traumatina. You know, this is going to be a much better penetrator. The other thing is, when you cut with this thin blade, and I believe the Condor at the base at least is probably twice as thick as this Traumatina. When you cut with this, especially if you just have a flat grind instead of a convex grind, it's very easy to get stuck in the wood, and that flex is necessary if you get stuck, but it also means it may be more difficult to get your blade out of there. So watch, if I come down a little lower, you know, that's not easy to get out, especially something that's moving like this on a big tree. If I went after a tree this diameter, want to be green, and probably be able to take it out easier. But also it wouldn't swing back and forth. But you know, it's thin enough, and the grind is such that it's more likely to bite. So that's why I like this Condor Terrachete as a machete that can be used both for field work and defensive use if you actually need to. I like the sheath. I consider this part of a single system. It has a nice constructed sheath. It has good blade design. I can use for thrusting and chopping. It has a weight forward blade shape. It doesn't have such a severe shape of the tip that I can't use it for thrusting, but in fact it's a very good thruster. I like the dual grinds he has on this. It has a long enough handle for my big hands. Like I said, you know, my full height, I was only 6'1". That's not a giant, guys. But a lot of manufacturers seem to think, you know, that I have a giant hand. I don't think I do. I think I have a normal size hand, especially for a blue collar worker who's worked with his hands, or me, like a martial artist. To me, this is a normal size hand for most American men who had to work with their hands, like my dad and my uncles, who were blue collar mechanics and things like that, or martial artists or weightlifters. Anyone in that category tends to have a pretty wide hand. So you need a long grip to accommodate that wide hand. So lots of good things about this Condor. Thank you, guys. Train hard, train smart, and when it comes to tools like this, choose wisely.